welcome to the Brothers Random Show. My name is Travis.
And I'm Michael.
And we are two ordinary brothers discussing extraordinary ideas and some random shit. The topics that we usually cover are theology, masculinity, movies, philosophy, books, pop culture, and many other subjects. We often talk about the people we admire and the wisdom that they share. People such as Jordan B. Peterson, who we believe is the sage of our time. Another sage that we have with us in part 2 of our discussion is Nathan Dilts, who considers himself a fundamentalist Mormon. Is that right? Is that inaccurate?
That's a great question. It's an irony because I think 9 out of 10 fundamentalists would recommend Denteen and would say I am not a fundamentalist or I'm a failed polygamist. Church members would definitely be like, "Ooh, you are an apostate fundamentalist." So yeah, I guess I would say I am a person who's striving to follow the restored gospel of Jesus Christ as best he can. And at this point, I'm never in the business of saying no to any of God's commandments, as long as they're legitimately from God, not like crazy stuff. But at the same time, I'm not I've never actually been a skirt chaser or a guy who's tried to just add wives and to be a righteous patriarch or anything. That's not ever been my bag. So I don't anticipate that I will, excepting some extraordinary circumstance, I don't anticipate my living the principle ever again. Primarily because I don't see the principle as about my righteousness or proving my righteousness to God. I think that the principle is there as an opportunity, like it talks about in Jacob 34 or Jacob 4, and Doctrine and Covenants 132, as a commandment that the Lord gives to fulfill his plan and purposes. And it's not about me or seeing how many ladies I can get or anything like that, nothing like that. So because I don't have an agenda like that, and since most of my children are grown, and about half of them are grown and the other half are on that cusp of crossing over into adulthood. And it seems like if I were to get another wife now, I'd just be a serial monogamist in the weirdest possible way. It's just, so so it's a weird question. Like I say, I think most fundamentalists would have a hard time viewing me as a legit fundamentalist, and then most church members would be like, "Oh, he's a fundamentalist." So
what do you consider yourself at? You're not part of the FLDS, or I'm sorry, the United AUB. That's the one I can't never remember.
I'm in a funny place with I'm actually in a good place with the AUB. So there was a period of time. Last time we talked about kind of my experience about how I came into AUB or the work or the group. And it was originally under Rulon, and I was very welcomed, had tremendous time. And then Rulon passed away, and he passed the torch to Lemoyne Jensen. And that was an interesting thing that happened there. And I actually got along with Brother Lemoyne Jensen very well, had very positive experiences with him personally. However, there was a big shift between Rulon and Lemoyne Jensen. Rulon was
Owen, and then Lemoyne. You kept saying Rulon.
I kept saying, Owen.
You're
sorry,
good.
I was under Rulon. Owen passed the torch to Rulon. Owen passed the torch to Lemoyne. I had personally great experiences with Lemoyne, but there was a definite shift in culture at that point. And I don't know that we want to necessarily get into the wheres and why fors and whatnots, but in a nutshell, by my own ears, I heard Owen say on no less than 3 occasions, if there's ever a disagreement between what Jesus Christ taught, Joseph Smith taught, or the Book of Mormon teaches, and what I say, you follow Jesus Christ, Joseph Smith, and the Book of Mormon. Like, he said that in my ears, no less than 3
times.
That was Owen. Then Lemoyne came in, and well, I guess I do have to give it in a very short nutshell because we're not doing the history of the group podcast. But in a nutshell, a strange thing happened when I came in. There was a huge influx of converts from the church at the same time I came in. It was me and a dozen other guys and things. And in the church, you have this sort of rote testimony. I know the church is true. I know Joseph Smith's prophet, the Book of Mormon is true. I know this is the true and living church, and that so and so is the prophet and the only true and living prophet and seer and revelator on the earth. Well, they basically brought this rote sort of testimony and set of convictions in, and the work, and they started applying it to Lemoyne. And they were applying it to Owen too, but Owen was pretty good about saying, no, I'm just a man. He wouldn't let you call him Elder Owen. It was just Brother Owen and things. And so, but they were trying to foist this on him, like, you're the man. And I think he did get colored by it a little bit in the end, but he did a largely good job of not letting that get to his head. But Lemoyne, they were a lot more arduous in really pushing that on him. And they're sort of developed this cadre of folks that were mind guards. And when you have an organization as big as the church, there's sort of this default check and balance. Like, church leaders in a church that's international and 11 million strong, they can't go too wildly off the rails without seriously blowing up the whole institution. And so there's this sort of de facto check and balance. But when you take this same sort of salute and obey your file leader, and you apply it to somebody who's the leader of a small group, you can go off the rails. And I'm not saying Lemoyne did, but the culture started shifting significantly. And all of a sudden, strange doctrines and this shift towards follow your file leader and things like that start coming in play. And I was one of the ones that was outspokenly against this shift in the culture. I was like, hey guys, we can't go down this road. Like, the thing with Mormon fundamentalism, and I'm not talking about wacko Mormon fundamentalism. I'm talking about if you can have a mainstream Mormon fundamentalism. The funny thing is it's like, if you do follow your file leader, like, that doesn't work, because if it's follow your file leader, and we should have done that back with Wilford Woodruff, and we should all be monogamous and part of the main church. See, this is the philosophical, theological, and logical inconsistency. If you all of a sudden are like a break-off group, and then you're like, now we'll obey the leader. It's like, so we weren't supposed to obey him when we split and started doing our own thing, but now we're supposed to obey you. That's a complete logical. The only way that mainstream Mormon fundamentalism has any leg to stand on is the idea that God honors us because we honor his commandments. That's the only leg we have. The church gets to play the authority card from Joseph Smith to, President Nielsen now, right? They're playing the authority card. And essentially every Mormon split off group is playing the authority card as well. But anybody who's really honest, and this was a big part for me in my conversion, it's like, I realized very quickly, it's the whole foundation of this is God will only honor us as we're honoring his commandments. If it's follow your file leader, well, then I might as well go back to the church and do that program, because
and fall in line
meant you gave up the polygamy back when Wilford Woodruff and Grant put the brakes on it, and so anyway, so this cultural shift started happening, and I started resisting it. Like, you would really have these brethren, these 70s and these mind guards coming in with follow your file leader. They started coming up with strange doctrines like, and trust me, Mormon fundamentalism has plenty of, and their fair share and more of strange doctrines, but I'm talking really wild stuff like a helper God doctrine, which is a really bizarre derivative of Adam God doctrine.
So before you get too deep into that, I wanted to say, so I've said this before on this podcast, and the problem with these groups, the major problem with these groups, and you realize this when you watch the documentary, the Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey. You realize that the groups are one bad leader away from becoming absolute shit cult, essentially.
Oh, absolutely. Yep.
So
the FLDS group is a perfect example of that. When they first split with our group AUB, they had a council, and then it became this father-son. Then the father dies, then it became the son, and it just. And this is where and this, I think, I was blessed when I gave you my background on the last show, where I talked about how my dad worked for the church his entire career. And so I got a lot of very hard and fast lessons on there's a distinction between men and the gospel of Jesus Christ, and don't mix up the misbehavior or the bad behavior of men with the gospel of Jesus Christ, and don't use that as your excuse to forsake the gospel of Jesus Christ, but also don't blindly follow man. Like, all those lessons came into play for me now, because it's like I'm sitting here looking at, some bad behavior and some bad doctrine and things. And it's like, for me, my conviction of the gospel of Jesus Christ has remained the same. But it's like, why are we introducing these strange doctrines and teachings?
So one of the points of this, though, are, and this, I'm going to challenge you just a bit on all this, because one of the points for somebody, the outside looking in, is that it's kind of a pick and choose doctrine. And this is what the whole almost all of Mormonism is essentially based on, because Joseph Smith did this himself. He gets the book out, then he goes and then he gets into the different doctrines, further into the different doctrines, the doctrine of polygamy, the doctrine of the Adam God doctrine, all this stuff that for lack of a better, I'm not trying to insult you by saying that this is
no, you're not
him just making it up as he goes, just like any leader would, just like the Mormon church currently does, and I've told this story before, but the Mormon church at one point had the Mormon.org posters everywhere and billboards everywhere, and it was like the number one thing that they were doing up until that prophet dies, and then the next prophet comes in and they get rid of all that. So the whole point is that
don't call us Mormons.
Yeah, don't call us Mormons.
We're Church LDS. Of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Yeah, and so
say the whole thing.
My point being is that this is this wishy-washy, this the new leaders here. This happens in all of Christendom. The new pope comes in and he wants to change some stuff to the whole thing. And one of my biggest complaints about religion, right? And what you're telling me is that you found that this religion that you had joined had done this after a new leader comes in, and then am I accurate in saying that you precipitously left after that? Are you not?
Well, I think what really, if I'm, and obviously if you ask them, they would probably have a very different perspective. But from my point of view, as clear-eyed and unbiased as I could possibly be from my personal point of view, I think what really happened is I just kept getting consecutively pushed and marginalized to the sides. It was a strange, it's such a funny thing. Because I wouldn't just bend the knee, and because I resisted a lot of these mind guards that were, putting themselves up as like kind of the authorities behind the throne. And I'm not painting myself as heroic by any means, or that it was this titanic clash of my goodness against their evil. No, it was with some of them, it was a very kind of brotherly and loving debate. One of the guys who eventually became a member of the council, which is one of the leading men of the group, His name was Harry, and I'll just leave it there, and because I don't want to be like, I'm not saying this to knock him, but I would go up to him after a Wednesday night priesthood class or something where he taught something. I'm like, and I would just hash it out, and we had a lot of very good and brotherly exchanges. Like, it was like, and I sort of did it in the spirit of like, hey, I'm looking at this in the scriptures, I'm not seeing it the same way, what are you seeing? And I challenge him and everything, and but then there were other guys who just, I drove them nuts because I was questioning anything, and I could give those names, and I probably wouldn't feel bad about doing it, but just to be a little bit classy, I'll abstain. But
No,
the
that's
point
okay.
is, they were more of the "you will okay," and they were just pissed that I'd even raise a question contrary to their divine appointed opinion, and it's like, wait a minute, who are you? And so it's like. And so I just found myself increasingly pushed out and marginalized. They started uncalling me from, teaching classes, and then they did this sort of a monkey court, but then they didn't actually end up actually excommunicating me or disfellowshipping me. They just did this monkey court, and then nothing came of it. And then what happened is it switched from Lemoyne to another gentleman. And that's where my marginalization was a great moment for me. I stepped into another community that I found was much more open, loving, and accepting. And everybody in this community is a believer in the restored gospel of Jesus Christ through Joseph Smith. But in the community I'm in now, we have Woolleyites, we have guys who are current members of like AUB in the group. You have guys like me who are kind of marginalized and pushed out guys, black sheep. You have regular church Mormon. So we have this really eclectic group, and there's no centralized authority. And this is sort of where I found a home, is a place where there's no centralized authority for my head to find another head.
Do you still believe in the idea of the prophet then, if you've left that kind of group?
Well, here's the funny thing. I think even when I was a member of the church, my view and understanding of what a prophet was is not what church members make a prophet. Like, for me, a prophet is somebody who is called by God's own voice to call his people to repentance when basically they've gone outside the boundaries of covenant, and he's calling them back in. Even when I was a missionary and I was just a everyday member of the church, like, I was deeply uncomfortable with this whole thing of prophet, seer, revelator, president, prophet, seer, revelator. I have no problem with the guy being the president of the church. Like, I get that. That's his administrative function in his office. You're a prophet when you are called by God's voice to call his people to come back under the covenant. And when you're doing that by the Holy Ghost and, with the spirit of prophecy, then you're being a prophet. And when you're a seer, that one's the one that bothered me the most. Like, I know Joseph Smith was a seer, but who else has used interpreters lately?
Can I challenge you on that?
Yeah.
How are you certain?
This is probably where we should get into the under banner of heaven stuff. Yeah. But go ahead, Travis, and then we'll kind of run with it.
I'm going to kind of get into this because I am not looking to tear anybody's religion down at all. I don't care. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to just point out that you just mentioned that you thought that you knew that the prophet of Joseph Smith was a seer and revelator.
Yeah.
I recently come across a bunch of stuff that maybe implies that he was a charlatan.
Right. And there's a lot of that going around, and I get it. So let's talk about that for a second, because that's a really fair point you're bringing up. And I'm more than happy to speak to this, because one of the things that I teach my own children is, and I'm so cautious about this, because I'm really glad you're challenging me on it. Because in Mormonism, it's very pat to say, I know a thing. Like, it's sort of rote in every Church Mormon's testimony. I know the church is true. I know the Book of Mormon is true. I know President so-and-so is the prophet.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
mm-hmm.
and you sort of get scripted with that. And to be fair, I should be more careful and clear on my wording. I was saying that in that sort of a sense of it. I am fully cognizant and aware that a lot of my convictions are convictions of faith. And those convictions of faith, I fully acknowledge our choice. Now, I could talk to you about a handful, not like a ton. I'm not a guy who walks and talks with Jesus every day and shares a Coke, or have ever, I have had a handful of experiences that I have a deep personal conviction were transcendent, were me experiencing something of the divine that I feel was more than just myself, more than mentally induced euphoria or self-delusion. And that's my personal conviction. And I am from that. So I have made certain choices about my faith. So when I say I know Joseph Smith was a seer, I choose to exercise faith in the idea that Joseph Smith was a seer, and I do it based on the fruit of the Book of Mormon and his testimony of how he translated it.
That is probably the best way to talk about faith, period.
Yeah. I'm this way with my children too. Is I'm clear to them that it's like when I say I know a thing, I'll sometimes let that slip out like that, but more often I'll stop and say, look, at some point, faith is a choice, because until God personally shows up to me and I heft the plates or hold the interpreters or the Urim and Tumim or the Urim and Thummim, until these things are put, and I could give you that one. I don't get to say I know, like that. No, it's a choice of faith, and I fully acknowledge that.
So this is where I'm going to take a little bit of issue. Yeah. Like I agree. The best way to express a faith is to say, this is what I believe in. This is what but here's the problem with our society nowadays is that everything is boiled down to my truth, and the truth doesn't matter anymore. And this is something similar. So this is happening in society in general, where there's a person out there who believes that they are a man when they were born a woman. Right? So this is them exercising their truth. This is the same thing that religion does, right? Now, I'm not against religion.
No. If so, I'm certain. Well, definitely secular religionists and atheistic religionists definitely do this.
Yes.
Anybody
what I'm trying to get at though is the same thing, because when you take a belief that there is no proving value to it, you can't prove it, and then you just say this is my truth or my faith, you're saying the same thing that somebody outside looking in can go, well, that's BS because that's your truth, but it's not the truth, right? So you take an object.
Yes, I understand the spirit of what you're saying. I think I understand the spirit of what you were saying. One distinction I would add on to that is if anybody's sincere about their faith, I really detest the whole my truth thing, because that's you're taking something that's definitionally supposed to be objective. Like, the word truth by its definition should be an objective reality that can be verified by, I'm not a materialist by any means. I think there are things that transcend our capacity to measure through our five senses.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I think faith has a special, a unique place, because faith invites you to explore it and see if you come to that same conviction through your own experience, particularly Mormonism. I don't think that's true of all faiths, but my point is like, obviously one of the big tenets, especially in the Book of Mormon, is the idea of the invitation that you can pray and ask God for yourself if these things are true. And you can go and seek for that encounter with the divine, with yourself. And some people, obtain that experience for themselves and come to the same conviction, and others don't. And others are just sometimes obnoxious about it. But my point is like, the idea is that.
So you're saying it's just a personal thing, right? Because I detest the whole my truth thing too. I don't like it, but I also, because I've left this group, I can also take that same idea, the my truth idea, you can apply it to faith, like a person having
you could almost swap out the terms and say, instead of my truth, my faith is X, Y, Z, right? And
how do you square that around, or that square peg into a round hole? What do you think about that
in terms of
that idea? The philosophies are very similar, and they also have a cult light mentality.
The best way I can speak to this point, I tried to color it with two distinctions. The first one is this: what are when we talk about my truth or my faith and objective truth, I think anybody who's really sober, and I'm going to just say this and then we can think about it and discuss it, but I think anybody who's really sober about faith versus objective truth, one of the distinctions and one of the ways to measure whether or not your faith or your truth actually has any congruence with objective reality is, what are the fruits of that faith? So you brought up the example, a guy who says, he's born biologically a male, but he says, my truth is I'm now a girl. And it's like, well, okay, what are the fruits of that? And in every respect, it's like, when all the choices you make and all the things that happen around you, are you running into roadblock after roadblock? Is your suffering going up or down? Like, one of the things we talk about Jordan B. Peterson, and we talk about Ben Shapiro and guys like that, they like to say facts don't care about your feelings. They also talk about how you can, you go off the cliff of reality and you're going to find that, fiery ball at the bottom of that cliff. And it's like, so you sit there and make these expressions of faith, and see, we could apply this to like these cults or these Warren Jeffs type groups. What are the fruits of this? Well, when you see, the misery and the suffering and the abuse and the violation of boundaries and the things like that, clearly objective truth and what they're saying is truth and faith, they're absolutely at odds with each other. And so in my own faith, and this is the thing, is like, I haven't ever met a truly honest atheist. I've met a gazillion really honest agnostics, and I love my honest agnostics. I think atheists are as ridiculous as I am, because they're just in denial about the fact that they're actually a faith-based religionist group themselves. You're just ridiculous. You're not being intellectually or logically honest.
So if we go,
who's serious about their faith is measuring their faith and their convictions against objective reality based on the fruits. That's
on the fruits. I like that idea, because that also goes into and I mentioned this before on the show, the the difference between a cult and a religion is how the individual is treated. If the individual is treated poorly, if their freedoms are taken away, if they're like segregated from their family, that's a cult. And and then if they're, so the fruits, I like this idea about religion that you just mentioned. It's the fruits.
Well, it kind of goes along with, we talked in one of our Exodus episodes, we talked about Dennis Prager has this thought that he says, and I'll try to remember it, but he says, if my hope is that every atheist will become a bad person, and every bad religious person will become an atheist, because he says that one of the biggest things that an atheist will point to is bad people. If you're a bad person and you're religious, then why should I ever accept your religion? So yeah. I don't know if that kind of goes in with by their fruits you shall know them.
Well, I love both of what you're saying, and if we marry them together, it's funny because you talk about what's the difference between a cult and a religion, and I agree with you, Travis, 100% about what you're saying. In terms of that violation of boundaries, oppression, all those things. Those are definitely predatory leaders, cult creating leaders, and all that. Here's the interesting thing: you can have a religion, and people can come into it, and this is something I don't think gets talked about enough, because you have a lot of people that talk about cults as if there's something that happened to them, like it just happened to them, like they thought they were joining this nice hot dog eating community church thing, and then all of a sudden it was a cult. Like, no, I'm sorry, there's not enough discussion around the idea that you have people like Under the Banner of Heaven, the Laffertys. They were ideal regular Mormon church, and then they grew cult-like in their thinking, and eventually they became so cultish they got tossed out of the regular church or the religion and became their own crazy thing, right? And this idea that a cult is a thing, a cult, without doubt, I am not diminishing the responsibility and abrogating the accountability of wicked leaders who do wicked things or anything like that. I'm not diminishing that in the least, but people are not being honest when they don't acknowledge their part in having joined a cult and becoming a cultic in a cult. And It frustrates me. Like, I have to take responsibility for the choices I made when I left the church and became a fundamentalist and became AUP. And I had to be responsible for who I was when I was in the group and what got me marginalized. And I have to take responsibility for who I am and in the community that I'm in now. And to sit there and pretend like, oh, this cult just happened to me and I'm such a victim of no, you had a hand in participating in the cult.
Well, and some
people that can cult their way in a regular church.
That's our society now. They don't want to take responsibility for anything, and it's all they did this to me. Now, I guess we should get into the Laffertys, Under the Banner of Heaven.
Sure.
I think Michael will just make this two. We'll make this 2 episodes because
let's go with it. Let's do it.
We're gonna have to wrap this up in about 30 minutes, but okay. So there's 2 things I want to talk to you about. First of all, Joseph Smith, according to Under the Banner of Heaven, the book. Now, I just recently finished the book, and it's very well done, and it's a very embarrassing book for the LDS Church and most fundamentalisms, because they don't look good either in that book. They talk at the very beginning, it talks about a lawsuit that they have, supposedly, according to this book, they have documentation of in the early 1800s about a lawsuit that had been brought against Joseph Smith for basically fraud. He had taken a seer stone to a guy who owned a ranch. He told him that he could see the treasure through this stone, and which was a big deal at the time. The occult was happening. It was a big deal. Seances were happening, all this kind of stuff. And Joseph Smith took advantage of this, and this guy supposedly paid him several weeks of work to find treasure, and he didn't find any. And then there was the lawsuit. Now, according to the book, it says that he was actually convicted of fraud, and he had to pay out. I can't remember how much, but what do you have to say about the leader of your faith being this charlatan?
A money digger and a charlatan. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get confronted by these kinds of questions, especially now. Like, in fact, just 2 or 3 weeks ago, I dealt with a bunch of masonry and the endowment questions. And it's funny because I happen to be a Mason, and anyway, it's I'm gonna tell you what I'm the reason I'm pausing here for a second is I want to be, there's a part of me that wants to go straight into apologetics and try to give historical context and all of these things. But I think the direction I'm going to go with this question, because there's plenty of people that address these kind of questions, and the church even they're starting to actually develop some pretty intelligent and well contextualized, explorations of these difficult questions about early church history. But here's what I'm going to answer that, and in terms of faith, because a lot of these kind of debunking YouTube channels and things, and I'm not like, I totally get it, and I want people to explore, and I want them to ask the hard questions and things, because I don't. One of the things I really like is the word Jacob, the name Jacob in Hebrew. It means dissembler or liar, one who lies by hiding. And then he wrestles with God, and God throws out his hip. And afterwards, he gives him a name, and he calls him Israel. And Israel in Hebrew means to wrestle. And so I think it's an extraordinarily good thing to, instead of hiding and dissembling, instead of being a Jacob, it's much better to be in Israel, where you're wrestling. So I'm not, like, I love these kind of questions and this kind of conversation and dialogue. And I guess the way I'm going to approach it here, especially with the 3 minutes we have left that are going to stretch into 20, not by me, of course, but the way I'm going to address this is, we could tackle all the uncomfortable details in church history and go after them. And so many guys sit here and they'll find these things and they'll be like, well, is that what a prophet of God would do? Or if God was really speaking to that man, would he have done this? Well, we could have those discussions and dialogues, and we can look at, I guess I would immediately go to historical biblical prophets like Samson. I mean, that guy was a D-bag, and yet the Lord used him. Jesus Christ's own pedigree has the daughters who took advantage of their father in a moment of drunkenness, has a woman who set herself up as a whore to get her, father-in-law to get her pregnant. Like, by Jesus Christ's own pedigree is full of, really savory characters. And that was one of the funny things that happened during Christ's time is a lot of people thought John the Baptist was the Messiah because he had the pedigree that they were all expecting the Messiah to come through. He was the son of a priest of the order of Abia, and he was preaching repentance with power and authority and was baptizing. And he was their image of what the Messiah was going to be. And yet this dude, like, what good thing comes out of Nazareth? And had this seedy, genealogy and everything. He was not, the guy and so, an imperfect vessel being used by the Lord we could have really good conversations, but the way I'm going to take this right now, and sort of in closing, not in closing unless you close it, but what I'm going to do to close this, my answer to this is I look at the fruits that Joseph Smith brought, and in terms of theology, and whether or not they make people better disciples of Jesus Christ and better to each other. And the things he brought to the table was a book of scripture that was a second witness of Jesus Christ, that explored the idea that Christ was the Messiah for everyone all over the world, whether you were in the old world where he came and ministered in his mortality, or whether you're over here in the Americas as one of the original peoples. The idea that there are eternal families, like, that's a huge concept, and it should shift dramatically how we treat each other and see each other in marriages and things like that. So the idea of eternal relationship, the idea of that we existed before we came here, and that we're eternal beings that are on an eternal path of progression. Like, do these things raise our value in each other's eyes and cause us to treat each other better and be better disciples of Christ? And he's without a question, Joseph was a flawed vessel, and I won't pretend that he wasn't. And just as a really cool snippet, I think you'll like this. I was listening to a radio interview a long time ago. It was like Radio of the West, and he was interviewing the man who was the religion writer for the New York Times, a job that, by the way, if New York Times is listening, I would love to have someday. But anyway, he was a religion writer, and he spent 80% of his time covering the Catholic Church, because obviously they're kind of the big deal in Western Christianity. Yeah. And he's talking to this guy who's a Mormon radio show host out here in Utah, and he says, in closing, what do you think is the biggest difference between Mormons and Catholics? And he said, well, that's a really good question. And he said one of the most profound things I ever heard. He said, in Catholicism, the doctrine is that whenever the Pope sits on his throne as the vicar of Christ and speaks, that is the literal voice and word of God through him, and should be taken as such. And no Catholic believes it. Mormons, on the other hand, teach that their prophet is just a man, and is just a man, and is full of flaws and failing, and they don't believe it. And it was one of the best and most brilliant, concise. He nailed it right on the head. It's like everything that Catholics are supposed to believe about the Pope, they don't. But we believe that about the Mormon prophet, right? Like and that's a real issue, not only from cult problems, but it's a real issue from this idea that all of a sudden, when they're the prophets, seers, and revelators, when you find flaws, that's the end of the world and the end of your faith. And it's like, no, the idea that Joseph Smith was flawed, and I'm not gonna sit here and try to dance around what he did or minimize what he did. If he did it, he did it. But I think the better argument, instead of can God use a flawed vessel, is what were the fruits that Joseph Smith brought to man, and do they make us better disciples of Christ and better to each other?
That's a good point.
Mic drop.
Mic drop.
Nice.
Yeah.
Great. Let's wrap up that one.
Let's wrap up that one, I guess.
Very cool.
Very cool. We appreciate you being on this, Nathan.
My honor, guy.
It's obvious that we're obviously gonna disagree on a lot of things, but I
hope so.
But I really respect everything you have to say. I don't discredit anything. And Under the Banner Heaven is a great read, and
I agree with you.
It's such a embarrassing indictment on Mormonism in general. So
it's funny. I when I read it, I thought it was actually extraordinarily fair. Especially when I have had enough experience now, and I've because I was doing this interview, I just read it again today, and but I had read it like, I don't know, probably a year after it came out. So whenever it was published, plus a year, I read it back then, and I didn't have context, but I thought it was pretty fair back then. And when I read it again after having 25 years in fundamentalism, I thought it was very fair. I thought it certainly beat Fawn Brody's book. That was a disaster. But
what book is that?
No Man Knows My History by Fawn Brody.
Oh, okay,
now,
I got you.
Here's the thing, even though it's kind of crap, here's the thing that I appreciate about that book is it was the first attempt for someone to try to more honestly and objectively talk about Joseph Smith and his history. And it was a first attempt. And she brought a lot of weird Freudian psychoanalytic crap that was like hip in the 80s. It's like, I don't think you can psychoanalyze Joe from the couch when he's been in the dirt for 100 years. But, go for it, lady. That's your bag. But, but the fact that somebody made an effort, because up to that point, all the works about Joseph Smith had been largely produced by the church, and they were basically, faith promoting story books,
well, and that's another cult like behavior.
Yeah.
Is it basically you can't read anything that hasn't been produced by this cult. So.
Right. And so, like, I don't like some of Fawn Brody's Freudian psychoanalytic 80s babble crap. Like, I'm sure she figured out what Joe Smith's repressed memories were, and he was abused as a child by.
Did you watch the show that was on Hulu of Under the Banner of Heaven?
I haven't seen the show. I've just read the book twice now, and like I said, last time was today, so that was fun.
It's a good show. They take some liberties, but it's a good show. I would highly recommend it.
Yeah, I'll check it out. And yeah, we definitely shouldn't cover up or run away from that's been going on for far too long. So any effort to like bring things to light and transparency, I think is better. The only way to deal with uncomfortable things is to bring more light and truth to it. And like I say, we should not ever make an apology for the incorrect decisions of leaders, because that leaves room for us to do the same thing to others.
Yeah.
And so that's imperative. But in the same breath, we should also be careful to realize that since God uses, from my position of chosen faith, since God uses any man, he's always using a flawed vessel. Now, at the same time, you cannot ignore, if the vessel becomes too flawed, it should really make you suspect, and this is, I think, where your point of view is really valuable. At what point does the flawed vessel become a broken vessel? And that's a real discussion, because I'm sitting here from my vantage point poo-pooing and poshing Warren Jeffs and things, but some people would look at what Joseph did and think that was as bad or worse than what Warren Jeffs did. So how do I get to say to Warren and be like, well, I can deal with Joseph as a flawed vessel? That's a serious question and a good discussion to have, because at what point does it become so flawed that it's broken? And now you're hurting people and pulling them from Christ versus bringing them to Christ.
Well, it could be the amount of power that you get. That could be the difference, because once you get a certain amount of power, do you abuse it? You would hope that you don't, but there's way too many examples of good men abusing that power once they get to that power.
Well, even Joseph Smith himself in the 121st Doctrine and Covenants, he said that as soon as men get a little authority, as they suppose, they immediately begin to exercise unrighteous dominion.
Yeah.
So by his own revelation, that's 100% true. I know I've definitely pulled the a-hole card out once in a while and played it, and in those moments, I am definitely neither a good disciple or by my own convictions, a priesthood holder or anything like that. So, yeah. But you were going to close this up.
Yeah, let's wrap this up. it's getting late, and I'm sure I'm supposed to be somewhere. So, thank you, Nathan, for doing this.
Thank you.
Michael, what are our socials?
Oh, we got the Twitter is at the brothers. It's at brothers v random, and Instagram is at the brothers random, and so is that's YouTube as well. And if you wanted to email us, it's the brothers random v at gmail.
We are also on Apple and Spotify podcasts, if anybody's interested. I forgot to do the bags last time, but these are the bags. Please like, share, and subscribe. Do all that. And Nathan, again, thank you very much, sir, for being on here. And we will.
My honor, anytime, guys. And I'm glad you're having these discussions, man. I think they're super important. I think it's important to have that wrestle.
Yeah, it is. I agree. We're always wrestling. We are Israel.
We who wrestle with God, Israel.
We are Israel. Keep listening, keep reading, keep watching, learn more. Have a good one, guys.
And keep wrestling till the dawn comes. And when you do, God will respect you. Amen.
Amen. Goodbye. Goodbye, guys.